I never thought anyone could erase me so completely. 20 years ago, the man who broke my heart in the alleyway behind my old Brooklyn apartment just walked into my cafe, not recognizing the woman I've fought so hard to become. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of my small cafe in Astoria, Queens, casting long shadows across worn linoleum floors. At 72, I've learned that mornings hold both promise and pain. My arthritic fingers wrapped around the familiar weight of the metal coffee scoop, inhaling the rich aroma of freshly ground Colombian beans. The sound of the subway rumbling overhead mixed with distant car horns and the melodic calls of street vendors setting up their carts along Northern Boulevard. I wore my usual uniform that January morning, a faded blue apron over a cream sweater that had seen better decades, my gray hair pulled back in a practical bun that emphasized the deep lines around my eyes. Lines earned through years of worry, years of giving everything I had to people who never seemed to notice. My hands trembled slightly as I wiped down the counter for the third time, a nervous habit I'd developed after so many years of serving others while feeling invisible myself. The cafe itself told my story better than words ever could. Mismatched chairs surrounded small tables scarred by countless coffee cups and elbows. Vinyl records from the 70s hung on walls painted a hopeful yellow that had dulled to the color of old butter. Dog-eared paperback novels filled a corner bookshelf, their spines creased from being handled by customers who rarely bought anything but coffee. This was my world now, this 20 by 30 foot space that smelled perpetually of coffee grounds and unfulfilled dreams. The bell above the door chimed that Tuesday afternoon, its sharp metallic sound cutting through the quiet hum of the espresso machine. I looked up from counting the day's meager earnings, and my heart stopped. There he was. Michael. Standing in my doorway like a ghost made flesh, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture confident in the way that only comes with success and money. But it was the watch that caught my attention first, a gleaming Rolex Submariner that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back like a tiny sun on his wrist. He looked around my humble cafe with the casual assessment of a man accustomed to finer things, his gaze sliding past the mismatched furniture and settling on my face with polite indifference. Those blue eyes that once held my entire universe now looked at me as if I were simply another aging waitress in Queens. "Coffee, please," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered but still carrying that slight Long Island accent. Black. I stood there frozen, my mouth dry as desert sand. This was the man who had promised me forever on a snowy February night in 1984. The man who had held me while I cried about my mother's death and sworn he would never leave. The man who had vanished without a word 3 months later, taking with him not just my heart but my faith in love itself. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words escaped before I could stop them, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused, tilting his head slightly, studying my face with the same polite confusion he might show a store clerk trying to make conversation. A flush crept up his neck, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Recognition? Embarrassment? Or was it just annoyance at being delayed by an old woman's attempt at familiarity? "Should I?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the practiced distance of someone who had learned to navigate awkward social situations with smooth deflection. I swallowed the lump that had formed in my throat, tasting the metallic bitterness of suppressed tears. "Oh, Michael. How thoroughly you've forgotten the girl who waited for you. How completely you've erased the woman who loved you with every fiber of her 18-year-old heart." My hand shook as I poured his coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the white ceramic mug. I had dreamed of this moment for decades, imagined what I would say if I ever saw him again. In my fantasies, I was eloquent and composed, either forgiving or righteously angry, but always dignified. In reality, I was just a 72-year-old woman in a stained apron, invisible to the man who had once traced my face in the moonlight and promised we would grow old together. Let me take you back to understand how I got to this moment, standing in my own cafe, serving coffee to the ghost of my first love. Because this story isn't just about Michael walking back into my life. It's about everything that happened in the years between that February night in 1984 and this cold January afternoon in 2024. It's about the family I built and how they slowly, systematically, broke me down until I barely recognized myself in the mirror. After Michael disappeared, I discovered I was pregnant. 18 years old, working as a cashier at a grocery store in Bensonhurst, and suddenly responsible for a life I hadn't planned. My parents, traditional Italian Catholics, were devastated. My father didn't speak to me for months. My mother cried every day until I thought she might wash away entirely in her own tears. I named him David, after my grandfather who had died the year before. David grew up without knowing who his father was because how do you explain to a child that his father simply evaporated one winter morning, leaving behind only the ghost of coffee breath and broken promises? But I was young and strong then, and I believed that love could conquer anything. I worked double shifts at the grocery store and took night classes at Queen's College, determined to build something better for my son and myself. I met Robert when David was 3, a gentleman who worked construction and didn't mind that I came with baggage. Robert adopted David legally, gave us his name, and for 15 years, I thought I had found my happy ending. Robert and I had 2 more children, Sarah and Tommy. We bought a small house in Queens with a postage stamp yard where the kids could play. I planted tomatoes and basil, hung laundry on a line, and thought I understood what happiness felt like. Robert would come home covered in sawdust and concrete dust, his lunch pail empty, his smile tired but genuine. We were solid, comfortable, real in a way that my relationship with Michael had never been. But life has a way of testing the foundations you think are unshakable. Robert was diagnosed with lung cancer when he was 47. The construction work, the asbestos, the cigarettes he'd quit years too late, they all came back to claim their due. I became his caregiver while still working full-time, still raising 3 children who needed me to be strong even when I felt like I was crumbling from the inside out. I remember the hospital nights, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside his bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of machines that were keeping him alive. The smell of disinfectant and the harsh fluorescent lights became my world. I would hold his hand, feeling it grow thinner and more fragile each day, and wonder how I had become the kind of woman who lost everyone she loved. Robert died on a Tuesday in March, just as the first crocuses were pushing through the sidewalk cracks outside our house. The funeral was small, his construction buddies, some neighbors, my children looking lost and angry. I stood at his graveside in a black dress I'd bought at Kmart, holding Tommy's small hand while David and Sarah flanked me like bodyguards, all of us pretending to be stronger than we felt. After Robert's death, something shifted in our family dynamic. I had been the caretaker, the provider, the one who held everything together. But now I was also the widow, the vulnerable one, the woman who needed to be taken care of. My children seemed to sense this change before I did, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to treat me differently. It started small. David, now 23 and working as a mechanic, would borrow $20 for gas and forget to pay it back. Sarah, in her second year at Queen's College, needed help with textbooks, rent, groceries, always with the promise that she would pay me back once she graduated and got a good job. Tommy, still in high school, required money for school trips, sneakers, the 1,000 small expenses that come with raising a teenager. I said yes to everything. How could I not? These were my children, the lights of my life, the reason I got up every morning. I picked up extra shifts at the diner where I'd started working after Robert got sick. I cleaned offices at night, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans while the city slept, my knees aching on cold linoleum floors. "Mom, you don't have to work so hard," Sarah would say, but she still took the money I gave her for rent. "You should rest more," David would tell me, even as he asked for help with his car payment. "You're getting older, you should take care of yourself," Tommy would say before asking for money for senior pictures. The years blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and giving. I gave until my savings account was empty, until I had to choose between paying my own electric bill and helping Sarah with her student loans. I gave until my body ached in places I didn't know could ache, until I fell asleep at kitchen tables and woke up with my face pressed against unpaid bills. But the worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or even the financial strain. It was the feeling that I was becoming invisible, that my worth to my children was measured only in what I could provide. They called when they needed something, money, babysitting, a ride to the airport, someone to listen to their problems. But my own problems? My own needs? Those seemed to evaporate the moment they voiced their latest crisis. When I was hospitalized with pneumonia when I was 65, I lay in that hospital bed for 3 days before any of my children visited. David was busy with work. Sarah had exams. Tommy had a girlfriend who needed him. When they finally came, they seemed annoyed that I had gotten sick, as if my illness was an inconvenience to their schedules rather than a frightening reminder that I was mortal. "You should have called us sooner," Sarah said, but I had called. I had left voicemails that went unreturned, sent texts that received one-word replies. "We would have come if we knew it was serious," David said, but the shortness of breath and fever that preceded the pneumonia had been evident for weeks. They just hadn't noticed because they weren't really looking at me anymore. I began to feel like a ghost in my own life, essential for the services I provided but otherwise unseen. My birthdays passed with obligatory phone calls and cards bought at the last minute from grocery store racks. Christmas became a stress-filled obligation where I provided the food, the gifts, the warm home, while they provided their presence like it was a favor they were doing me. The breaking point came when I turned 70. I had imagined a small celebration, maybe dinner at the Italian restaurant where Robert and I used to go for anniversaries. Instead, Sarah called to cancel because she had a date. David forgot entirely and remembered 2 days later with a guilt-ridden text message. Tommy showed up an hour late with a wilted bouquet from the gas station, stayed for 20 minutes, and left to meet his friends. I sat alone in my kitchen that night, surrounded by the dinner I had cooked for 4 people who didn't come. The silence was deafening. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my loneliness. I wasn't just forgotten on my birthday, I was forgotten every day. I existed in their lives only as a function, not as a person with feelings, dreams, fears of my own. That night, I found myself looking through old photo albums, searching for evidence of the love I thought we shared. There were pictures of birthday parties I had thrown, Christmas mornings where I had stayed up all night wrapping presents, graduation ceremonies where I beamed with pride from the audience. But in most of these photos, I was behind the camera or on the sidelines, the facilitator of everyone else's happiness. It was then that I found the box of Michael's letters. I had kept them all these years, hidden in the back of my bedroom closet like shameful secrets. Letters from the 3 months we were together, full of promises and poetry and the grand dreams of young love. I read them that night with the bitter wisdom of 7 decades, and I realized that even then, even at 18, I had been giving more than I was receiving. Michael had loved the idea of me, the devoted girl who listened to his plans and supported his ambitions. But had he ever really seen me? Had he ever asked about my dreams, my fears, what I wanted from life beyond being his girlfriend? As I read his letters, I noticed how rarely he asked about my day, how most of his writing focused on his own experiences, his own feelings, his own plans for our future that always seemed to center around what he wanted to do, where he wanted to go. I cried that night, but not just for Michael. I cried for the pattern I had somehow established at 18 and repeated for the next 54 years. I gave and gave and gave, and I confused being needed with being loved. I had raised children who saw me as a resource rather than a person, who loved what I did for them but not who I was. The next morning, I decided to change my life. It started with small things. I stopped answering my phone every time it rang. I let some calls go to voicemail, especially the ones that came at inconvenient times or from numbers I recognized as belonging to bill collectors for my children's debts. I started saying no to some requests, not all of them, because I wasn't ready for that kind of revolution yet, but some. When David asked me to co-sign a loan for a motorcycle he couldn't afford, I said no. When Sarah wanted me to babysit her roommate's dog for 2 weeks while they went on vacation, I said no. When Tommy asked for money for a spring break trip, I said no. Each no felt like swallowing glass. I had been trained by decades of motherhood to say yes, to sacrifice, to put everyone else's needs before my own. But I forced myself to remember that hospital bed, those 3 days of loneliness while I struggled to breathe, and I found the strength to maintain my boundaries. My children's reactions were swift and predictable. David accused me of becoming selfish in my old age. Sarah said I was punishing them for being successful and independent. Tommy, now 24 and still living at home, sulked and complained that I was treating him like a child even though he was acting exactly like one. The guilt was crushing. I second-guessed every decision, lay awake at night wondering if I was being unfair, if I was pushing away the people I loved most. But slowly, gradually, I began to notice something interesting. The less available I made myself, the more respectful my children became. When they couldn't take my help for granted, they started asking more politely. When I wasn't always there to solve their problems, they started solving more problems themselves. It wasn't a transformation overnight. There were setbacks and arguments, tears and slammed doors. But for the first time in decades, I began to feel like a person rather than just a function. I started reading books that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. I took a pottery class at the community center. I bought myself flowers on random Wednesdays simply because they were beautiful. Most importantly, I decided to open the cafe. Robert had left me a small life insurance policy, enough to get by but not enough to feel secure. I had been working at the diner for years, serving other people's food, cleaning other people's messes, following other people's rules. The cafe represented something I had never had before, a space that was entirely mine. It wasn't grand or ambitious. The location in Astoria was affordable because it was small and somewhat run down. I spent months scrubbing and painting, learning how to operate an espresso machine, figuring out suppliers and permits and all the 1,000 details that go into running a small business. My children thought I was crazy. "Mom, you're 71 years old," Sarah said. "You should be thinking about retirement, not starting a business." "What if you fail?" David asked. What if you lose your money? Why can't you just enjoy being a grandmother? Tommy wanted to know. But I wasn't a grandmother. Not really. My children were too busy with their own lives to give me grandchildren, and even if they had, I suspected I would have been relegated to the role of free babysitter rather than beloved grandmother. The cafe became my refuge, my rebellion, my rebirth. It wasn't successful by conventional measures. I made enough to cover expenses and pay myself a modest salary, but I wasn't getting rich. What I was getting was something far more valuable: respect. From my regular customers, from the suppliers who learned they could count on me, from the neighborhood that slowly began to embrace the small space as a community gathering place. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived in the apartment above the flower shop next door, started coming in every morning for café con leche and the chance to practice her English. Marcus, a young father who worked nights as a security guard, would stop by after his shift to decompress with a double espresso and a paperback novel. Elena, recently divorced and starting over at 55, found in my cafe a safe space to work on her laptop and slowly rebuild her confidence. These people saw me not as a mother or a caregiver or a source of funds, but as Elena, the woman who made excellent coffee and remembered how everyone liked their orders. They asked about my day not because they needed something from me, but because they cared about the answer. They brought me small gifts: herbs from Mrs. Rodriguez's garden, a book Marcus thought I might enjoy, a scarf Elena had knitted during the long winter evenings. For the first time in decades, I felt valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. And then, on that gray January afternoon, Michael walked into my cafe and looked right through me as if I were air. The coffee grew cold in his cup as we stared at each other across the counter. I saw him calculating, trying to place my face in his memory. His eyes moved over my gray hair, my lined face, my simple clothing, and I knew he was struggling to reconcile this ordinary-looking older woman with whoever he thought he might know. Brooklyn, I said finally. 1984, the apartment on 18th Avenue with the broken heater. His face went pale. The confident businessman facade cracked just slightly, revealing a glimpse of the 20-year-old boy who had held me in that cold apartment and promised me the world. Elena, he whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. 54 years of suppressed grief rose in my chest like a tide. My God, he said, sinking into the nearest chair. Elena. I didn't recognize you. Of course he didn't. The girl he had known was 18, with dark hair that fell to her waist and dreams that sparkled in her eyes like stars. That girl believed in forever and thought love could overcome anything. That girl had no idea that she would spend the next 5 decades being taken for granted by almost everyone she loved. You look good, I lied, because what else do you say to a ghost? He did look good, actually. Successful, well-fed, comfortable in the way that money and status provide. His hair was silver rather than gray, styled rather than simply cut. His hands were soft and manicured, no longer the working-class hands I remembered. The boy from Bensonhurst had clearly done very well for himself. You own this place?" he asked, looking around the cafe with new eyes. I do. I was surprised by the pride in my own voice. 2 years now. He nodded slowly, still processing. I can't believe, after all these years. What are the odds? What were the odds, indeed? Of all the coffee shops in New York City, he had wandered into mine. Was it fate? Coincidence? Or was the universe finally ready to close a chapter one thought would remain forever unfinished? I think about you sometimes, he said quietly. Wonder what happened to you. If you were happy. If I were happy. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Was I happy? Had I ever been happy? Or had I been so busy trying to make everyone else happy that I had forgotten what my own happiness might look like? I had a good life, I said carefully. 3 children. A husband who loved me. He died 8 years ago. I'm sorry, Michael said, and he sounded like he meant it. Kids. All grown now. Living their own lives. What I didn't say was how those grown children treated me, how invisible I had become in their busy, self-centered worlds. What I didn't say was how I had built my identity around being needed and was only now learning how to exist without that constant sense of obligation. And you? I asked. Wife? Children? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 marriages. No kids. Turns out I'm not very good at the commitment thing. 3 marriages. I wondered if he had left those wives the way he had left me, disappearing without explanation when the reality of love became inconvenient. I wondered if he remembered walking away from me, or if I had become just another blurry face in his past, another chapter he had closed without looking back. Why did you leave? The question escaped before I could stop it, raw and vulnerable as an open wound. He was quiet for a long time, staring into his cold coffee. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I didn't expect: shame. I was 20 years old, he said. Scared. You were talking about getting married, having babies, settling down, and I panicked. I thought I had my whole life ahead of me, places to go, things to do. I thought you would hold me back. Hold him back. As if loving him, supporting his dreams, believing in his potential was somehow an anchor rather than wings. As if my love was a cage rather than a gift. I was going to tell you, he continued. I practiced the speech 100 times. But every time I looked at you, you seemed so happy, so sure about us, and I couldn't find the words. So I just left. Like a coward. Yes, like a coward. Like a selfish boy who took what he wanted and ran when it came time to give something back. But looking at him now, sitting in my cafe with his expensive watch and his 3 failed marriages, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad. Sad for the girl I had been, sad for the boy he had been, sad for all the years we had both spent running from ourselves. I waited for you, I said quietly. For weeks. I thought something had happened to you. I called hospitals, police stations. I thought maybe you had been hurt or killed, because I couldn't imagine that you would just leave without saying goodbye. His face crumpled. For a moment, the successful businessman disappeared entirely, and I saw the scared 20-year-old boy who had run away from love because he didn't know how to handle it. Elena, I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I am. I'm sorry for hurting you. I'm sorry for being too much of a coward to face you. I'm sorry for all of it. I accepted his apology with a nod, but I realized that I no longer needed it. The girl who had been devastated by his departure was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to survive much worse things than a broken heart. I had buried a husband, raised 3 children, endured decades of being taken for granted, and was finally learning to value myself. Michael's apology was 54 years too late to heal the wound he had left, but it wasn't too late to provide some closure. Thank you, I said simply. We sat in awkward silence for a while, both of us processing this unexpected reunion. I refilled his coffee without being asked, an automatic gesture that spoke to decades of caretaking. He pulled out his phone twice and put it away again, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional weight of the moment. I should go, he finally said, standing and reaching for his wallet. I have a meeting downtown. Of course he did. Even 54 years later, Michael had somewhere more important to be. He left a $20 tip for a $3 cup of coffee, as if money could somehow balance the scales of the past. I watched him walk toward the door, this stranger who had once been everything to me, and I felt nothing. No renewed heartbreak, no regret, no wishful thinking about what might have been. Just a quiet sadness for all the time we had both wasted running from the people we really were. At the door, he paused and turned back. Elena? For what it's worth, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I was just too stupid to know it at the time. After he left, I stood alone in my cafe, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of my new life. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memories. I thought about the girl I had been at 18, so eager to please, so desperate to be loved that she would accept any crumb of attention as if it were a feast. That girl had become a woman who spent decades giving everything she had to people who barely saw her as a person. My children, who loved me but took me for granted. My husband, who appreciated me but never quite understood the depth of my sacrifice. My community, which relied on me but rarely asked how I was doing. But here, in this small cafe that belonged entirely to me, I was finally learning what it meant to be seen. Not as someone's mother or wife or caregiver, but as Elena. Just Elena. A woman who made good coffee and listened carefully and had stories of her own worth telling. The bell chimed again, and Mrs. Rodriguez shuffled in, bundled against the January cold. Buenos tardes, Elena, she called out cheerfully. The usual? Coming right up, I replied, already reaching for her favorite mug. This was my life now. Small moments, simple pleasures, genuine connections with people who saw me as I really was. As I steamed milk for Mrs. Rodriguez's Café con leche, I realized that Michael's reappearance hadn't reopened old wounds as much as it had shown me how thoroughly they had healed. The girl who had waited for him would have been devastated to see him again, would have hoped for rekindled romance or at least genuine regret. The woman I had become was simply grateful for the reminder of how far I had traveled from that broken-hearted 18-year-old. But my story doesn't end there. Because while I was learning to value myself in small ways, my children were watching with growing alarm as their reliable source of support became less and less available. And they were not about to let their golden goose fly away without a fight. The first sign of trouble came when David showed up at the cafe unexpectedly on a Thursday morning, just as I was opening. He looked around the space with the same skeptical expression he had worn since I first told him about my business plans. Mom, we need to talk, he said, settling heavily into one of my mismatched chairs. I poured him coffee without asking, adding the cream and sugar he had preferred since he was a teenager. Some habits die hard, even when you're learning to set boundaries. What's on your mind? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Sarah's worried about you, he began, which was his way of saying he was worried but didn't want to admit it. This cafe thing, living alone, all these changes, we think maybe you're going through something. Going through something? As if learning to respect myself was a phase I would eventually outgrow. I'm going through learning to be happy, I said mildly. Is that what concerns you? He shifted uncomfortably. That's not. Mom, you're 72 years old. You shouldn't be working this hard. You should be relaxing, enjoying your retirement, spending time with family. Family. The word hung between us like a challenge. When, exactly, had my family made time for me to spend with them? When had they shown interest in my relaxation or happiness? I enjoy the work, I said. I like having a purpose beyond being available whenever one of you needs something. His face flushed. That's not fair. We don't just call you when we need something. But even as he said it, he looked uncomfortable, because we both knew it wasn't true. I made a mental note of the last time any of my children had called just to chat, just to see how I was doing, just because they missed talking to their mother. The silence stretched long enough to make David squirm. We love you, Mom, he said finally. We want what's best for you. And what's best for me is what, exactly? Being available to solve your problems? Giving you money whenever you ask? Pretending that my own needs don't matter? That's not. He stopped, clearly flustered. You're our mother. Taking care of us is what mothers do. There it was. The assumption that had governed my life for decades. That my role as a mother meant I existed primarily to serve, to support, to sacrifice. That my needs were always secondary to theirs, no matter how old they got or how capable they became of taking care of themselves. I took care of you when you were children, I said quietly. You're adults now. You don't need me to take care of you anymore. What you need is to learn to respect me as a person, not just as a source of help. David left that day clearly frustrated, probably planning to call his siblings and complain about my new attitude. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride. Pride in standing up for myself, pride in articulating my worth, pride in refusing to apologize for expecting basic respect from my own children. The confrontation with Sarah came 2 weeks later, and it was much more direct. She stormed into the cafe during the lunch rush, her face tight with anger. I was serving a regular customer, Marcus, who took one look at Sarah's expression and quickly made himself scarce. Mom, what the hell is wrong with you? Sarah demanded, not bothering to keep her voice down. I finished cleaning the espresso machine before responding, taking my time, refusing to be rushed into a reaction. Hello, Sarah. It's nice to see you too. Don't give me that. David said you accused us of using you. How can you say that? After everything we've been through together. Everything we had been through together. As if my decades of sacrifice were somehow a shared burden rather than something I had carried almost entirely alone. Sit down, I said calmly. Let's talk about this properly. I don't want to sit down. I want to know why you're suddenly acting like we're terrible children who don't appreciate you. Several customers were starting to stare, and I felt the familiar flush of embarrassment. Sarah had always been dramatic, but she usually saved her scenes for private moments. The fact that she was willing to air our family business in public told me how desperate she was feeling. Lower your voice, I said firmly. This is my business, and these are my customers. If you want to discuss this, we can do it respectfully, or you can leave. She blinked, clearly taken aback. I had never spoken to her that way before. In the past, I would have apologized for upsetting her, would have rushed to smooth over the conflict, would have made her emotional needs my immediate priority. Fine, she said, dropping into a chair with theatrical emphasis. But I want an explanation. I poured her a coffee she hadn't asked for and sat across from her. Sarah, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed something, not because you had news to share, just to check on your mother. She opened her mouth to answer and then closed it again. I watched her mentally scroll through recent conversations, looking for evidence to contradict what we both knew was true. I'm Busse, Mum. I work full-time and I'm trying to finish my master's degree and I have a social life. That doesn't mean I don't care about you. I'm not saying you don't care, I said. I'm saying you don't see me. None of you do. You see the things I do for you, but you don't see me as a person with my own needs and feelings and dreams. That's ridiculous. Of course we see you as a person. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams? When was the last time any of you showed interest in what I wanted from life, beyond being available to help with your problems? Another long silence. Sarah stared into her coffee cup as if it might provide answers. "We thought you were happy," she said finally, her voice smaller now. "You never complained." "I was trained not to complain. I was taught that good mothers sacrifice without complaint, that my job was to make your lives easier, that my happiness was supposed to come from your success and happiness." "So what changed? Why are you complaining now?" "What changed was Michael walking into my cafe and not recognizing me. What changed was realizing that I had spent so much of my life being what other people needed that I had forgotten who I was underneath all that service. What changed was understanding that being needed is not the same as being loved. What changed," I said carefully, "is that I realized I've been invisible for so long that even I forgot I existed. And I decided I deserve better than that." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but I could see the calculation behind them. This was how she had always handled conflict with me, with emotional displays that made me feel guilty for upsetting her. "So you're punishing us? Because we're not perfect children." "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just refusing to be taken for granted anymore." "But we need you, Mom. I need help with grad school expenses, and David's having problems with his business, and Tommy doesn't even have a steady job yet. This isn't the time for you to withdraw your support." There it was. The real issue. Not that they missed me or worried about my well-being, but that they were afraid their source of financial and emotional support was disappearing. "There will never be a convenient time for me to stop being your safety net," I said. "There will always be expenses, problems, crises that require my help. But I'm 72 years old, Sarah. When do I get to stop working multiple jobs to support adult children who are capable of supporting themselves?" The conversation went in circles for another hour, with Sarah alternating between tears, anger, and guilt trips. She left that day without resolution, but also without the promise of continued financial support she had clearly hoped to secure. Tommy's reaction was the most painful because it was the most honest. He had always been the baby of the family, indulged and protected even when he probably should have been pushed to grow up faster. Now 24, he still lived in my house, not the house I shared with the cafe, but the old family home I couldn't quite bring myself to sell. "I don't understand why you hate us now," he said one evening when I came home from the cafe to find him eating cereal for dinner in front of the television. "I don't hate you, Tommy. But I need you to start acting like an adult." "I am acting like an adult." I looked around the living room, his clothes draped over furniture, empty food containers on every surface, dishes piled in the sink from the weekend. "No, you're acting like a teenager whose mother will clean up after him. That's not the same thing." "I pay rent," he said defensively. The $200 a month he gave me didn't even cover the utilities, but I had been too guilty to ask for more. It was easier to subsidize his lazy lifestyle than to deal with his sulking when I asked him to contribute fairly. "Tommy, I need you to find your own place. I'm selling the house." The words came out before I had even consciously decided to say them, but as soon as I spoke, I knew they were true. I was selling the house. The mortgage was almost paid off, the neighborhood had gentrified, and the property value had tripled since Robert and I bought it 30 years ago. I could sell it, pay off my remaining debts, and have enough left over to live comfortably without depending on my children's irregular and reluctant contributions. "You can't sell the house." Tommy's voice cracked like he was 14 again. "This is where Dad died. This is where we grew up. You can't just throw away our family memories." "Our family memories?" As if I was the curator of everyone else's nostalgia rather than a person with the right to make decisions about my own life and property. "I can and I am," I said. "You have 3 months to find other arrangements." The scene that followed was ugly. Tommy accused me of becoming cruel and selfish in my old age. He said I was dishonoring Robert's memory by selling the house he had worked so hard to buy. He even suggested that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and needed professional help. But I stood firm. For the first time in decades, I prioritized my own needs over my child's comfort, and it felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. The real explosion came when all 3 of my children coordinated their response. They had clearly been talking to each other, planning their approach, deciding how to handle their suddenly difficult mother. This level of organization would have been touching if it had ever been applied to, say, planning my birthday celebrations or checking on my health. But they could certainly pull together when their own interests were threatened. They ambushed me at the cafe on a Saturday morning, arriving together just after the breakfast rush. David carried a folder full of papers, Sarah had her laptop open to what looked like medical websites, and Tommy looked like he had been crying. "Mom, we've been doing some research," David began, "and we think you might be experiencing early-stage dementia." I was so shocked I nearly dropped the coffee pot I was holding. "Excuse me?" "Think about it," Sarah chimed in, reading from her laptop screen. Sudden personality changes, irrational decision-making, anger toward family members, selling assets without consulting anyone, these are all warning signs. "We love you, Mom," Tommy added, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "We want to help you get the treatment you need." I set the coffee pot down very carefully and looked at my 3 children, these adults I had raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally, and realized they would rather believe I was mentally ill than accept that I had finally learned to value myself. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, please, just listen," David started. "Get out." My voice was loud enough to startle the few customers in the cafe, loud enough to surprise even me. "Get out of my business and don't come back until you're ready to treat me with respect." They left, but not before David dropped the folder on my counter. After they were gone, I opened it to find printouts of medical articles about dementia, pamphlets for assisted living facilities, and a business card for a lawyer who specialized in elder care issues. My own children were preparing to have me declared incompetent rather than accept my right to set boundaries. That night, I sat in my small apartment above the cafe, surrounded by the sounds of Queens settling into evening. Traffic hummed on Northern Boulevard, televisions murmured through thin walls, and somewhere nearby, a couple was arguing in a language I didn't recognize. These sounds, which had once made me feel lonely, now felt like companionship. I was part of a community, part of the life of the city, in a way I had never been when I was consumed with being everyone's caretaker. I thought about calling a lawyer of my own, just in case my children tried to follow through on their threats. I thought about changing the locks on the old house and giving Tommy formal eviction notice. I thought about a dozen defensive strategies to protect myself from the people who were supposed to protect me. But mostly, I thought about how free I felt. For the first time in my adult life, I was living according to my own values rather than constantly adjusting myself to meet other people's expectations. I was working because I wanted to, not because I had to support ungrateful adults. I was making decisions based on my own needs and desires rather than trying to keep everyone else happy. It was terrifying and exhilarating and lonely and wonderful all at the same time. The resolution, when it came, was both more dramatic and more subtle than I expected. 2 months after the dementia intervention, Sarah showed up at the cafe alone. She looked tired and somehow smaller than usual, her confidence deflated. She ordered a coffee and sat quietly in the corner for an hour before approaching the counter. "Mom? Can we talk?" I had been dreading and hoping for this conversation in equal measure. I missed my children desperately, but I wasn't willing to go back to being their emotional and financial servant. "Of course," I said, pouring myself a coffee and joining her at a table by the window. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began hesitantly. "About not seeing you as a person. And I think maybe you're right." It was a start, but I had learned not to trust easy admissions. "What changed your mind?" "I was talking to my therapist about our fight, expecting her to agree that you were being unreasonable. But she asked me when I had last done something nice for you that wasn't a response to something you had done for us first. And I couldn't answer." Sarah's therapist. It was somehow fitting that it took a stranger to help my daughter see what should have been obvious. "She helped me realize that I don't actually know very much about who you are beyond being our mother. I don't know what your favorite color is anymore, or what you like to read, or what you dream about. I know what you've done for us, but I don't know who you are." Tears started flowing down her cheeks, and this time they seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "I miss you, Mom. But I miss you in a selfish way. I miss having you available when I need support. I don't think I've missed you as a person because I never learned to see you as one." This felt different from our previous conversations. Harder and more honest and therefore more hopeful. "What's your favorite color?" I asked. She blinked, confused by the question. "If you want to know mine, I should know yours. What's your favorite color?" "Purple," she said slowly. "Deep purple, like eggplant." "Mine is green," I said. "Forest green. It reminds me of the woods where my grandmother used to take me when I was little, before she died." "I didn't know you had those kinds of memories with your grandmother." "You never asked." We sat in silence for a moment, both processing this simple exchange of information that should have happened decades ago. "I'd like to know more," Sarah said finally. "About your grandmother. About your childhood. About who you were before you became our mother." "I'd like that too," I admitted. It wasn't a magical reconciliation. Sarah didn't suddenly transform into the thoughtful, considerate daughter I had always hoped for. But it was a beginning, a recognition that our relationship needed to be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. David took longer to come around, and when he did, it was through action rather than words. He started showing up at the cafe occasionally, not to lecture or argue, but to fix things. The squeaky door. The wobbly table. the espresso machine that sometimes overflowed. He didn't ask for payment or praise, and we didn't talk much during these visits, but gradually I began to see them as his way of showing respect for my choices. Tommy was the most resistant, probably because he had the most to lose. He had grown comfortable with his subsidized lifestyle and wasn't eager to take on adult responsibilities. But when I sold the house and he was forced to find his own place, something shifted in our dynamic. He got a full-time job, found roommates, learned to manage his own finances. To my surprise, he seemed happier once he was standing on his own feet, more confident and mature than he had been when I was enabling his dependence. More importantly, when he achieved something on his own, got a promotion, fixed his own car, saved enough money for a small vacation, he called to share his success with genuine pride rather than simply expecting congratulations. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to an adult son rather than an overgrown teenager. But the most significant change was in how I saw myself. The cafe continued to be my sanctuary, but it also became something more, a place where I could experiment with being myself. I started hosting monthly poetry readings, discovering a love for performance and community building I never knew I had. I joined a book club that met at the local library, making friends who knew nothing about my history as everyone's caretaker. I signed up for salsa dancing lessons at the community center, laughing at my own clumsiness and not caring who was watching. Most surprisingly, I started dating. His name was Frank, and he was a regular customer who came in every Tuesday and Thursday for a cappuccino and a blueberry muffin. He was 75, a retired high school English teacher with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor. He had been widowed for 3 years and was slowly learning, like me, how to build a life that existed beyond caregiving. Our first date was coffee at my own cafe after closing hours. We talked about books and traveling and the neighborhoods where we had grown up. He told me about his late wife's battle with Alzheimer's, the years he had spent caring for her as she gradually disappeared into confusion and fear. I told him about Robert's cancer, the hospital nights, the feeling of being alone even when surrounded by family. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Being needed that intensely?" It was a good question, one I had been avoiding asking myself. "I miss feeling useful," I said finally. "But I don't miss feeling invisible. I don't miss being valued only for what I could provide rather than who I was." Frank nodded. "I loved taking care of Margaret. But I lost myself somewhere in all that caregiving. I forgot I was a person with my own interests and needs. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not responsible for someone else's well-being." We understood each other in a way that felt comfortable rather than tragic. We were both rebuilding our identities in our 70s, both learning to value ourselves as individuals rather than just as caretakers. It was a different kind of love than what I had experienced in my youth, quieter, more practical, based on genuine compatibility rather than desperate need. My children's reactions to Frank were telling. Sarah was politely supportive but clearly confused about why I needed a romantic relationship at my age. David was suspicious and protective, questioning Frank's motives and financial situation as if I were an innocent child rather than a woman with decades of experience judging character. Tommy was simply weirded out by the idea of his mother having a love life. None of them seemed to consider that I might be lonely, that I might enjoy masculine companionship, that I might deserve affection and romance in my 70s just as much as I had in my 20s. Their assumption seemed to be that my romantic and sexual life had ended when I became a widow, as if desire and connection were inappropriate for women my age. But their discomfort didn't matter to me the way it would have a few years earlier. I was learning to make decisions based on my own happiness rather than my children's comfort levels. Frank and I took things slowly, building a friendship that gradually deepened into something more intimate. We went to movies and art museums and concerts in the park. He introduced me to his adult children, who were polite and welcoming in a way that reminded me how families could function when they prioritized kindness over convenience. I introduced him to my regular customers, who adopted him into our small cafe community with enthusiasm. 6 months after our first date, Frank asked if I would like to travel with him to Italy. "I've always wanted to see Rome," he said. "And Florence. And maybe the Amalfi Coast. I know it's a big trip, and we haven't been together very long, but life is short, and I think we could have a wonderful time." Italy. I had dreamed of going to Italy since I was a child, imagining the landscapes my grandparents had described, the art I had seen in books, the food I had tried to recreate in my own kitchen. But there had never been time or money for such luxuries. First I was a young mother struggling to make ends meet, then I was caring for Robert, then I was supporting my adult children, then I was starting my business. "I would love that," I said, and as the words left my mouth, I realized it was the first time in decades I had said yes to something purely for my own pleasure. We spent weeks planning the trip, researching hotels and restaurants and museums. I bought new clothes, not practical work clothes, but beautiful things that made me feel elegant and feminine. I got my passport renewed, learned basic Italian phrases, read guidebooks about the places we would visit. My children's reactions were predictably mixed. Sarah worried about my safety traveling with someone I barely knew. David questioned the expense and suggested the money would be better saved for emergencies. Tommy simply couldn't understand why I would want to leave New York when everything I needed was right here. But for the first time, their opinions didn't dictate my choices. I was going to Italy because I wanted to go, because I deserved to see beautiful things and experience new adventures, because I was finally living for myself rather than constantly sacrificing my desires for other people's comfort. The trip was everything I had hoped and more. We walked through the Vatican Museum with Frank holding my hand, both of us overwhelmed by the beauty of Michelangelo's ceiling. We ate pasta and drank wine at tiny restaurants in Rome, laughing about our terrible Italian pronunciation. We watched the sunset from our hotel balcony in Florence, feeling young and adventurous and gloriously alive. On our last night in Italy, as we sat by the Mediterranean in Positano, Frank took my hand and said something that changed everything. "Elena, I want you to know that this trip, being with you, has reminded me what happiness feels like. I forgot, after Margaret died. I thought that part of my life was over. But you've shown me that it's possible to start again, even at our age." I felt tears on my cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. For the first time in my adult life, I was being cherished not for what I could do for someone else, but simply for who I was. When we returned to New York, I felt like a different person. Stronger, more confident, more aware of my own worth. The cafe seemed smaller somehow, not confining but cozy, a perfect base for a life that now included possibilities I had never imagined. My relationship with my children continued to evolve, slowly and sometimes painfully. There were still moments when they reverted to their old patterns, calling only when they needed something, assuming I would drop everything to help with their latest crisis. But I had learned to redirect these conversations, to offer emotional support without financial bailouts, to express love without sacrificing my own well-being. More importantly, I was teaching them through example what it looked like to value themselves. Sarah watched me set boundaries and began setting her own limits with demanding friends and colleagues. David saw me pursue my interests and started taking evening classes in woodworking, rediscovering a passion he had abandoned years ago. Tommy observed my relationship with Frank and began to understand that healthy partnerships were based on mutual respect rather than one-sided dependency. The changes were gradual, but they were real. Family dinners became more balanced conversations where people asked about my day as well as sharing their own news. Holiday celebrations became collaborative efforts rather than events I planned and executed while everyone else simply showed up. My children started bringing me small gifts, books they thought I would enjoy, flowers from their gardens, photographs from their travels, tokens of thoughtfulness rather than obligation. It wasn't perfect. Decades of dysfunction couldn't be erased overnight, and there were still conflicts and misunderstandings. But there was also genuine love, finally expressed in ways that felt reciprocal rather than extractive. And then, just when I thought I had found my equilibrium, life threw me one more curveball. It was a Thursday afternoon in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after Michael's surprise visit to my cafe. I was arranging flowers in small vases for the tables, tulips from Mrs. Rodriguez's garden, when the door chime announced a customer. I looked up to see a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair and familiar blue eyes. She stood in the doorway uncertainly, looking around the cafe as if she wasn't sure she was in the right place. "Are you Elena?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" "My name is Sophia," she said, stepping closer to the counter. "Sophia Chen. I think you might be my grandmother." The world tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "My father is Michael Chen. He told me he had a relationship with a woman named Elena many years ago, before he was married to my mother. He said she lived in Brooklyn, and that he thought she might have had a child." "My child. David. Michael's son, raised by Robert, carrying Robert's name, never knowing his biological father's identity." "Your father," I said carefully, "does he know you're here?" Sophia shook her head. "He told me about you after his last divorce. He said he regretted many things in his life, but losing you was his biggest regret. He said he wondered sometimes if you had been pregnant when he left, but he was too much of a coward to contact you and find out." Too much of a coward. Even after all these years, that description still fit. "I hired a private investigator," Sophia continued. "It wasn't hard to find you once I had your name and general location. But I wanted to meet you before I told my father anything. I wanted to see if you would want to know us." "Us?" As if she and Michael were a package deal, as if acknowledging one meant accepting both. I studied her face, looking for traces of David in her features. She had Michael's eyes and nose, but her mouth and chin reminded me of my son. My son, who was also her half-brother, though she didn't know it yet. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did you decide to look for me?" "My father is getting older," she said simply. "He's been married 3 times, never had children with any of his wives. I'm his only child, and I think he's lonely. He talks about you sometimes, about the girl he left behind in Brooklyn. He wonders what would have happened if he had stayed, if he had been brave enough to build a life with you. What would have happened?" Such a dangerous question, full of alternate histories and impossible dreams. "Sophia," I said gently, "there's something you need to know. I did have a child. Asson. He's 54 now, married with children of his own." Her eyes widened. "Asson. My half-brother?" "Yes. His name is David." "Does he know about my father?" "No. My husband adopted him when he was young. As far as David knows, Robert was his biological father." Sophia sank into the nearest chair, processing this information. I poured her a coffee without asking, using the time to think about what this revelation meant for all of us. "What do you want from me?" I asked, sitting across from her. "I want to know my family," she said simply. "I want to know you, and my half-brother, and his children. I want my father to have the chance to meet his son, even if it's 54 years too late." "And what if David doesn't want to meet his biological father? What if learning the truth about his parentage hurts more than it helps?" "Then we'll respect his wishes," Sophia said. "But shouldn't he have the choice? Shouldn't he have the right to know where he comes from?" She was right, of course. David did have the right to know his biological origins, even if the timing was inconvenient and the circumstances complicated. But I also knew my son, knew how this revelation might shake his sense of identity and family loyalty. Robert had been a wonderful father to him, and learning that his real father was a man who had abandoned his pregnant girlfriend might feel like a betrayal of the man who had actually raised him. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "This affects more people than just you and me. I need to figure out how to handle this carefully." Sophia nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She had probably hoped for a tearful reunion, an immediate embrace of the family connection she was offering. "Can I give you my phone number?" she asked. "In case you decide you'd like to talk more?" I took her card, noting the Manhattan address and the job title that suggested she had inherited Michael's ambition if not his cowardice. She worked in finance, made good money, lived independently. She seemed genuinely kind, respectful of the complicated emotions this situation stirred up. After she left, I sat alone in my cafe, surrounded by the comfortable routines of my rebuilt life, and tried to imagine how to integrate this new complexity into the equilibrium I had worked so hard to achieve. That evening, I called Frank and told him about Sophia's visit. He listened without interrupting, asking thoughtful questions that helped me process my own feelings. "What does your heart tell you to do?" he asked finally. "My heart tells me that secrets usually cause more damage than truth," I said. "But my head tells me that some truths are too disruptive to unleash without careful consideration." "What if you started small? What if you told David about his biological father without mentioning that the man's daughter has contacted you? Give him time to process that information before introducing the possibility of meeting his half-sister." It was good advice, practical and compassionate. But it also meant having one of the most difficult conversations of my life with my oldest son. I asked David to meet me at the cafe on a Sunday morning when we would have privacy. He arrived prompt and cheerful, bringing coffee cake from a bakery in his neighborhood and chatting about his work and his wife's latest pottery class. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. He looked so content, so settled in his understanding of himself and his family. Did I have the right to disrupt that peace? "David," I said finally, "I need to tell you something about your father. Your biological father." His expression shifted immediately from relaxed to wary. "What about him? I thought he was dead." "I never said he was dead. I just said he wasn't part of our lives." "Same thing, isn't it?" "No, it's not. He's alive, David. And recently, I found out that he's been wondering about you all these years." I told him the story carefully, starting with my relationship with Michael and ending with Sophia's visit the day before. David listened in silence, his coffee growing cold in front of him, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like grief. "So my real father is alive," he said finally. "And he has another daughter. And neither of them cared enough to find me until now." "He didn't know for certain that you existed," I said gently. "And his daughter only learned about the possibility recently. But he suspected. He left you, knowing you might be pregnant, and he never bothered to check." There was no arguing with that assessment. Michael had been a coward 54 years ago, and the consequences of that cowardice were sitting across from me in the form of my son's pain. I don't want to meet him, David said flatly. I don't want to meet either of them. Dad was my father. Robert Silva was my father. This other man is just a sperm donor. I understood his reaction, had expected it. But I also heard something else underneath his anger: curiosity, longing, the eternal human need to understand our origins. You don't have to decide anything right now, I said. Take some time to think about it. Talk to Elena about it. Maybe consider talking to a counselor who specializes in family reunification. Elena? For a moment, he looked confused. Your wife, David. Elena. She has the same name I do, remember? He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Two Elenas. My mother and my wife. I guess I have a type. Maybe you chose a woman who reminded you of the love you received growing up, I suggested. That wouldn't be such a bad thing. Maybe. He was quiet for a long time, staring out the cafe window at the Sunday morning traffic. What's she like? The sister? Sophia? She seems kind, intelligent, respectful of the complexity of the situation. And him? Michael? I thought about the man who had walked into my cafe with his expensive watch and his casual indifference. Successful. Wealthy. Still handsome. Still running away from emotional complications, judging by his 3 failed marriages. Sounds like a real prize, David said bitterly. He's a flawed man who made selfish choices when he was young, I said. But he's also your biological father, and that's a fact you'll have to live with regardless of whether you choose to meet him. David left that day without making any commitments, but he took Sophia's business card with him. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, and when he finally called, his voice was different, more thoughtful, less angry. I want to meet her first, he said. The sister. Before I decide anything about him. I think that's wise. Will you set it up? Will you be there when we meet? Of course. The meeting took place at the cafe on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I closed early, hanging a sign in the window that said, "Private event," which wasn't entirely untrue. Sophia arrived first, nervous and overdressed in a way that reminded me of someone trying to make a good impression. David came 10 minutes later, looking skeptical but determined. I introduced them and then stepped back, letting them navigate this unprecedented situation themselves. They sat across from each other at the same table where David and I had discussed Michael 2 weeks earlier, both of them examining the face of the sibling they had never known existed. You look like him, Sophia said finally. Our father. The eyes especially. You look like Mom, David replied, which surprised me. I studied Sophia's features again, looking for traces of myself in her face and finding them in unexpected places. They talked for over 2 hours, sharing basic biographical information, comparing childhood memories, looking for common ground. Sophia was an only child, raised by a mother who had never remarried after her divorce from Michael. David was the oldest of 3, part of a complicated but loving family that had always accepted him completely. She had grown up wealthy but emotionally isolated. He had grown up working class but surrounded by siblings and extended family. Despite their different backgrounds, they connected in ways that surprised all of us. They shared a dry sense of humor, a tendency toward perfectionism, a love of old movies and good food. They both played piano, both enjoyed hiking, both had complicated relationships with their respective parents. I'd like to stay in touch, Sophia said as the afternoon wound down. If that's okay with you. I'd like that too, David replied, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans to have dinner the following week. As they prepared to leave, Sophia turned to me with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said simply. For letting this happen. For raising such a wonderful man. For being brave enough to tell him the truth. After they left, I sat alone in my cafe, processing what had just happened. My son had found a sister, my family had expanded in ways I never could have anticipated, and somehow, despite all the potential for disaster, it felt like a blessing rather than a complication. But the story wasn't over. 2 weeks later, Sophia called to tell me that David had agreed to meet Michael. He wants you there, she said. He says he needs your support to get through it. Are you sure that's wise? This is between the 2 of them. He insists. He said you're the bridge between his past and his present, and he needs you there to help him make sense of it all. So once again, my cafe became the setting for a reunion I never could have imagined. Michael arrived first, looking nervous in a way I had never seen from him. The confident businessman facade was cracking, revealing the anxiety underneath. Thank you for arranging this, he said, his voice unsteady. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but having the chance to meet my son, it means everything to me. This isn't about you and me, Michael, I said firmly. This is about you and David. Don't make it complicated by bringing our history into it. He nodded, looking chastened. You're right. Of course you're right. David arrived exactly on time, which was characteristic of him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, studying the man who had contributed half his DNA, and I saw recognition flicker across his features. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same blue eyes, the same strong jawline, the same tall frame. David, Michael said, standing up slowly. My God. You look just like me at that age. So I've been told, David replied coolly, but he moved forward and extended his hand for a formal handshake. They sat across from each other, with me at a nearby table, close enough to provide support but far enough away to give them space for their conversation. It was awkward at first, full of stilted questions and careful answers. Michael asked about David's work, his family, his interests. David responded politely but without warmth. But gradually, something shifted. Michael began talking about his own father, a man he had barely known, and David responded with stories about Robert, the man who had actually raised him. They found common ground in discussing the challenges of fatherhood, the weight of family expectations, the difficulty of knowing how to be a good man in a complicated world. I want you to know, Michael said finally, that not a day has gone by in the last 54 years that I haven't wondered about you. I don't expect forgiveness, and I certainly don't expect a relationship, but I needed you to know that you were never forgotten. David was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but not angry. I had a good father, he said. Robert Silva was everything a father should be, present, supportive, loving, reliable. I don't need another father now, and I can't pretend that your genetic contribution somehow earned you that role. Michael flinched but nodded. I understand. But, David continued, I'm glad to know where I come from. And I'm glad Sophia found us. She's a good person, and I'm grateful to have her in my life. She is good, Michael agreed. Better than I deserve. None of us get what we deserve, David said quietly. We get what we get, and then we decide what to do with it. It wasn't a Hollywood reconciliation. There were no tears or embraces, no declarations of love or promises of regular contact. But there was closure, understanding, a recognition that they were connected by biology and history even if they would never be connected by genuine affection. Michael left my cafe that day with something he had been seeking for decades, knowledge of his son, confirmation that his genetic legacy had produced a good man despite his own failures as a father. David left with something he hadn't known he needed, complete understanding of his origins, closure around the questions that had lurked in the background of his identity for 54 years. And I left with something I had never expected, a sense of completion, a feeling that the circle had finally closed on the most painful chapter of my youth. In the months that followed, my life settled into a new rhythm that incorporated all these changes. David and Sophia developed a genuine sibling relationship, texting regularly and meeting for dinner once a month. Sarah and Tommy were initially suspicious of this new family member but gradually warmed to her as they realized she wasn't competing for resources or attention. Michael remained on the periphery, respectful of David's boundaries but grateful for occasional updates about his son's life. Most importantly, my relationship with my children continued to evolve in positive directions. Having Sophia in their lives seemed to give them a new perspective on family dynamics, and they began treating me with more consideration and respect. They still had their selfish moments, but they also made genuine efforts to show appreciation for my sacrifices over the years. Frank and I continued to grow closer, taking another trip to Europe and talking about the possibility of moving in together. My cafe thrived, becoming a true community gathering place where neighbors came not just for coffee but for conversation and connection. And sometimes, late at night when the cafe was closed and Queens was settling into darkness around me, I allowed myself to feel proud of how far I had come. From the heartbroken 18-year-old who waited for a boy who never came back, to the exhausted middle-aged mother who gave everything to ungrateful children, to the 72-year-old woman who had finally learned to value herself. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when I thought I might not survive the loneliness and disappointment. But I had survived. More than that, I had eventually thrived. Michael walking into my cafe that January afternoon had been the catalyst for everything that followed, not because he had magically returned to heal old wounds, but because seeing him reminded me of how invisible I had become. His inability to recognize me forced me to confront the fact that I had spent so many years being what other people needed that I had forgotten who I actually was. But in learning to see myself clearly, in demanding respect from the people who claimed to love me, in building a life that reflected my own values and desires rather than everyone else's expectations, I had discovered something remarkable. I was worth knowing. I was worth loving. I was worth celebrating, not just for what I could do for others, but for who I was as an individual. And that realization, hard-won and long-delayed, changed everything. As I write this, sitting in my cafe on a quiet Sunday morning with autumn light streaming through the windows and the familiar sounds of queens waking up around me, I am not the same woman who served coffee to her first love and watched him walk away without recognition. I am not the same woman who gave and gave until there was nothing left of herself to give. I am Elena Silva, 73 years old, owner of a small cafe in Astoria, lover of Italian food and old movies and Frank's gentle humor. I am the mother of 3 adults who are slowly learning to treat me as a person rather than a resource. I am the friend of neighbors who see me and value me for exactly who I am. I am the grandmother of children who will grow up understanding that love is not measured in sacrifice but in respect, consideration, and genuine care. I am all of these things, and I am enough. Finally, beautifully, completely enough. Have you ever found yourself invisible in your own life, valued only for what you could provide rather than who you are? Have you ever had to choose between being needed and being respected? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this story touched something in you, if it felt familiar in ways that made your heart ache or your spirit soar, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult, necessary conversations about family, love, and the courage it takes to value ourselves in a world that often wants to use us up. Sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to love ourselves enough to demand better. Sometimes the most important journey is the one that leads us home to who we've always been underneath all the roles we've played for other people. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for understanding that it's never too late to start again.